I thought retirement was going to be all quiet mornings and bad coffee. Then a gray van made 4 slow passes down our street, and everything that meant safe got redefined in minutes. They showed up in uniforms that weren't real, with badges that looked right from a prop shop. And when one of them put his hand on my wife's phone and smacked her, something in me switched off the small talk and turned very, very certain. This is the story of how a backyard confrontation spiraled into a criminal case, how ordinary neighbors were pushed into extraordinary choices, and why sometimes doing the right thing looks a lot like refusing to be scared. My name is Mark Hale. I'm 53, retired from the Coast Guard after 28 years boats, salt, long nights on a bridge that feels like God forgot to water in. I've never been one for drama. I like coffee with way too much sugar. My wife Lena grows roses like she's trying to win back the world one petal at a time. And our house on Sycamore Lane has no HOA, which meant we prided ourselves on neighborhood freedom, not rules. We moved to Ridgewater because it felt like that kind of place. Porches, barbecues, people who borrow sugar and return it with a story. I'd tell you this was a small-town fairy tale if it weren't for the fact that within 30 minutes of the van's first pass, fairy tales were very clearly no longer on offer. Lena was out back, knees bent over the rose bushes, humming the wrong words to an old song, and the van rolled by so slow I remember the hum of its tires on the asphalt like a countdown. I said to myself, probably nothing, which is what people tell themselves before something happens. The van circled again. Third time I noticed the 2 men in cheap gray polos, and the 4th time they got out. They wore badges clipped to their shirts laminated, mismatched fonts, and one of them called out "Community Enforcement" in a voice that tried way too hard to sound official. I watched Lena straighten up slowly, squinting like she knew this moment could bend one way or another. She asked them for identification. They went quiet and smiled in a way that meant nerves, not confidence. The leader, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, with a kind of permanently tired grin, stepped forward and said, "Ma'am, we have a complaint. This is routine." Lena asked again for an ID. He moved as if to show it, and then grabbed her phone out of her hand. My stomach made a noise I'd later realize was not actually Minea flinch from something older than me. Lena tried to pull it back. He slapped her, right across the face, and the sound of that slap cut the air like a file. I walked out of the kitchen and across the porch in 3 long strides. There are moments you rehearse in your head when you're a kid, dreams of stepping between danger and someone you love. None of those rehearsals include the sticky, precise panic of the real thing. I remember thinking, very calmly, that I had to be precise. "Hey, hand it over," I said. My voice sounded like the neighbor version of my old commanding voice. Clear, no nonsense. The man looked up at me as if I had appeared out of nowhere, like a ghost wearing a cardigan. He bristled. The other 2 men, one skinny and quick, the other squat and pugnacious, moved closer. I didn't know their names. I knew the slow burn of an argument starting. "You don't need to worry about this, sir," the leader said, too slick. "We're handling—" "My wife is right here," I said. "Give her phone back." He laughed. That laugh was a trigger. I remember Lena's hand going to her cheek, and the light in her eyes that refused to dim. I moved forward, not fast, but with the kind of certainty that comes from years of practice at thinking clearly under pressure, practice at reading intentions. The skinny one lunged. I sidestepped and used his momentum to put him down on the grass with minimal damage. The pugnacious one swung at me. I blocked and controlled, not to hurt, but to stop. The leader tried to pull something, maybe a badge, maybe just torque, but I saw his movement and tightened the space between us. The neighbor who'd come out with his dog, Tommy, stood frozen with the leash in his hand like he was waiting for permission to be brave. That's a look I know. I've seen it around docks and bilges and old men's bars, bravely waiting for a cue. I'll be honest, in those seconds, there was no thought of revenge. There was only a need to end the threat and protect Lena. Each move I made was about containment, not spectacle. The skinny man's wrist bent in a way that made him drop the phone, and the leader, who'd been mouthing things about enforcement and authority, found himself on his knees before he understood why. He tried to keep the smile, weak attempt at control, and I could see the narrative he had rehearsed in his head crumble in the grass. Lena's breath came fast, her eyes wide, but otherwise she was okay, shaken, certainly, but stubborn as ever. When she came to me and wrapped her arms around my waist, what I felt then was not triumph. It was relief that we'd both be able to sleep tonight, Not because the violence had been prevented, but because we'd refused to let it win. We called 911. I gave the dispatcher a statement that was stripped of flourish. 3 men, fake uniforms, van, address. The police arrived and began to do what they do: take pictures, interview witnesses, gather the pieces. That's when I started to notice things that would later matter. The badges were heat-sealed in plastic, but the words were generic, community enforcement, rather than any named association. The van's plates were covered in dirt that looked freshly smeared. No paperwork, no real IDs. It took the officers 30 minutes to verify basic things, and by then the men had been detained at the curb, hands cuffed, faces still trying to recalculate, as if some new horizon had appeared. What followed was not a straightforward arrest-and-forget story. The police were good, but they told us we'd likely be witnesses in a larger case if this was a pattern as they suspected. It turned out, as the detectives later pieced together, that these 3 men weren't community enforcement. They were part of a small, ugly operation that preyed on the naive or the isolated people who might be scared into compliance by someone who looked official. Their method was simple: show up in a neighborhood with a complaint, make a scene, and, if needed, escalate to intimidation. The leader of the group was clever about plausible deniability: fake paperwork, false claims, and a slow push toward submission. And then came the email from Detective Maya Price at the county office. Precise, not a single extraneous word. She wanted our statements and the photos. She told us they were tracing the van's plates, checking cell records, speaking to other neighborhoods. Over the next few days, Ridgewater learned it wasn't an isolated incident. A report came in from a cul-de-sac on the other side of town: similar van, similar uniforms, similar language. Across the county line, someone recognized the same logo on a badge, and a pattern emerged like a map coming into focus. It wasn't just about one house on Sycamore Lane. It was about a racket. The middle act, the long, tedious, sometimes infuriating middle act, was not cinematic. Court and investigations rarely are. There were hours of paperwork, line items of evidence, forensics on the badges that showed they were printed from a consumer-grade printer, and inquiries to a shell company that had been set up under the name of a supposed HOA president who did not, in fact, exist. Detectives pieced together bank transfers that suggested the fake HOA had been collecting fines and running a whisper campaign against people who didn't comply. Motive, as it often is, had money at its center: small sums taken frequently, the kind that people pay because it's easier than arguing. But there was also human motive: jealousy, the taste of control, the way power feels when you can frighten someone into silence. One of the defendants, a lanky younger man with the kind of smile that thinks the world owes him more, had been seen at neighborhood board meetings in other towns, asking questions that weren't questions so much as probes. Another had a history of petty theft. The leader had a misdemeanor record that suggested a person who liked to orchestrate rather than get his hands dirty. There were flyers, interviews, neighbors who admitted to paying small fees and then being shamed out of town. It was ugly, less dramatic than the slap in my backyard, but far more calculating. During the investigation, people in Ridgewater began to pick sides in the way small towns do. Some wanted to believe it was an isolated criminal and were relieved. Others suspected the deeper rot that allowed such operations to succeed: apathy, the culture of not asking too many questions, the willingness to let someone else enforce the rules. Conversations at block parties shifted. You could feel the thread of mistrust beneath the usual chatter about kids' soccer games and spring cleanups. Lena, who's practical and soft-spoken, started a neighborhood meeting in our garage. She wanted people to talk because silence had been the quiet accomplice to what had happened. Tommy, the neighbor with the dog, brought up cameras and neighborhood watch ideas, and half the people nodded like they'd been waiting for someone else to say the obvious. Detective Price was methodical and kind in the blunt way of a person who cares. She explained chain of custody to us: photographs, statements, securing the badges. She asked for every scrap of detail: the cadence of the leader's voice, the van's smell, the color of the gloves. I found myself telling stories I'd replayed 100 times. What Lena was wearing, how the leader's breath smelled like cheap coffee, the way the third man's knuckles bore the faint scars of someone who uses his hands a lot. These mattered. They were the threads detectives could follow to tie a name to a face. One of the things that surprised me was how much the incident pulled friends into it. My old shipmate, Jorge, drove down from the next county with a duffel bag full of paperwork, the kind of friend who holds your story and sharpens it until it's useful. He helped make a timeline. Van passes at 10:12, third pass at 10:18, the slap at 10:21, calls to 911 at 10:25. These numbers helped plot cameras on nearby houses and find a business that had sold vinyl decals to the men. If this had been a movie, this would be the montage, the one where footage speeds up and the bad guy's plans unravel. In real life, it was a week of emails, subpoenas, and the hum of a printer in the prosecutor's office. When the DA finally charged the three men with impersonation, assault, and conspiracy to commit theft by intimidation, there was relief tempered with the knowledge that legal systems are slow and imperfect. The prosecution crafted a case that emphasized pattern and premeditation, not just a fight in a backyard, but a racketeering-like approach of systematic deception. The defense tried the usual: this was a misunderstanding. Their badges were authorized by a private contracting firm. They were engaged in citizen enforcement. It was thin. The evidence that Detective Price and her team had gathered: phone records, witness statements, photos stacked in a way that made the defense look reactive rather than proactive. Lena's testimony in court was precise and quiet. She told the judge about the way the leader's voice had tried to sound official, how the slap landed like a punctuation mark in our day. "I asked him for ID," she said, and the way she said it carried weight. Simple, unassuming, and utterly devastating in its clarity. There were moments in court when the room breathed with us, when other victims who'd been intimidated by the same operation came forward, when the photos of the counterfeit badges were shown under the courtroom lights, and every fake font and misaligned logo looked like a self-portrait of the scam. One by one, the prosecution walked the jury through motive, method, and money. We wanted restitution, yes, but that was almost secondary. What mattered more was accountability, the idea that there are consequences when you try to buy fear. In one of the more cinematic moments that felt strangely like justice, the leader's face betrayed a flicker of anger when the jury watched security footage from another neighborhood where the men had been videotaped trespassing. He kept trying to perform the role of confident orchestrator and failing. At sentencing, the judge's words were measured: punishment, restitution, and a note that such behavior would not be tolerated in their county. It was a small triumph within a legal system that often feels reluctant to flex its muscle. But the end of the courtroom drama didn't end the debate in Ridgewater. There was a split that revealed more about community than the crime itself. Some residents felt we'd gone too fair an overreaction to a group of guys who might have been trying to do a job. Others argued that the law was the law and the shame of being intimidated shouldn't be a ticket to silence. Social media threads lit up with hot takes. Was this really an HOA issue? One comment asked. Why didn't the victim just comply? Another wrote, as if compliance is a moral good when the alternative is being struck. Lena and I watched these arguments like people watching a small fire, aware it could spread. We also heard stories from friends, women who were frightened into paying fines, elderly couples who were shaken but unwilling to pursue charges. The crime had a ripple effect. It's easy to romanticize vigilante justice movies, love it, but what I learned in the weeks after was that protecting your home doesn't mean looking for a fight. It means looking for the truth and using institutions when they work, and when they don't, pushing them until they do. I'm not proud of the physicality in the backyard that day. I'm proud that I chose to do what was necessary. There's a difference. When we refuse to be intimidated, we force the issue into sunlight. People who benefit from secrecy and fear count on silence. There's a quieter part of the story, too, the way that personal aftermath settles like dust. Lena stopped pruning roses for a while. She'd go outside and stand by the fence and look at the neighborhood, as if it were a map with too many hidden paths. We sat at the kitchen table and watched reruns because my hands shook when I tried to do more. I had nightmares, rare, sharp, like flares, and I'd wake up thinking through timelines. My hands tightened around the mug until the ceramic hurt. That's the part nobody talks about, the unglamorous cleanup of nerves. Detective Price mentioned it in passing, like a companionable fact. Traumatic events don't go away because there's a verdict. They get managed. You learn to live with the memory, not deny it. We also had friends who came over and made casseroles and sat with us while we tried to sort the day into something with a beginning, middle, and end. In a strange way, those casseroles were therapy. People invited us to barbecues, and we accepted because it reminded us the neighborhood wasn't all predators and fear. The great good in this story isn't the courtroom. It's the way the community, even divided and muddied, still pulled together when push came to shove. Tommy and his old lady brought over a camera for our front porch because he wanted to do his part. Lena started a text chain for neighbors to verify any official-looking people before they let them onto private property. We started a little newsletter, Sycamore Watch, with information about how to confirm official credentials and contact numbers for local law enforcement. And yet, true to the messy and most things have, there was an unresolved edge. During the trial, rumors swirled about who had hired the operation. Some fingers pointed at a property development company trying to push reluctant homeowners to sell. Others whispered about an embittered ex-board member who felt wronged. In the end, the DA couldn't tie the racket to a single person beyond the 3 who were arrested. Evidence suggested they had some clients, people who benefited from fear, but not enough to prove a higher conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt. That left the story open. It wasn't a neat bow. It was a knot you could pull at, and sometimes, pulling produced more string than you expected. That unresolved thread worked on people. At the neighborhood meeting in our garage, the old men and the young moms listened as I explained the legalities and as Detective Price explained the limits of prosecution. Law is a blunt instrument, she told the room, and everyone nodded because it was both true and maddening. Lena stood up and said something better. We can't wait for proof to protect our neighbors, she said. We have to act now to keep each other safe, share information, look out for one another, call when something's wrong. It was practical, ordinary, and importantly actionable. People liked actionable. There are scenes in my mind that keep replaying like evidence in a loop. Lena asking for ID, the slap that was a punctuation mark, the van's slow drift away after the police took the suspects. There was the way the leader's face hardened when the judge read the sentence, his confidence cracking like old paint. There was the quiet moment in the holding cell when a man who'd been part of the scam looked at me and said, "You should have let us do our job." He meant it like a philosophy, as if intimidation is a civic function. I simply said, "Then you picked the wrong town." Years from now, I suspect some neighbors will still tell the story differently. Some will say we overreacted. Some will tell it like a legend of courage. That's the nature of memory. It's a shape-shifting thing. For Lena and me, it's a line we draw in the yard, literal and figurative. We put up a camera, we trim roses at our own pace, and we live here with our eyes open. I talk to new neighbors more than I used to. I ask about their lives and their routines because familiarity is the best defense against being preyed upon. It's awkward, sometimes, to ask your neighbor, "Do you have any problems with enforcement groups?" But it's a small awkwardness compared to the alternative. If there is a moral here, it's not simple. It's not fight back or surrender. It's about community vigilance and the strength of ordinary people who refuse to be cowed. Justice matters because it signals a boundary. You can't buy fear, you can't traffic in it, not without paying the cost. People who try to institutionalize intimidation rely on our passivity. When we refuse to be passive, we force them to adapt or to be caught. There's dignity in refusing to be smaller than you are. I do not like violence. I do not thrive on it. What I do advocate for is preparation and solidarity. Know your neighbors. Keep records. If someone shows up in an official-looking uniform, ask for the paperwork, ask who authorized them, and verify. The small bureaucratic steps make a note of a van's plate. Take a picture sound tedious, but they build the case for the truth when something ugly happens. I'm not giving a manual on how to fight. I'm giving you the plain facts of what helped us. Clarity, documentation, and refusing to tolerate behavior that erodes trust. At the core of all this is something tender, Lena's resilience. She came back from that afternoon quieter, but not broken. She pruned roses again, but slower, hands careful. She started a small community garden project, something to stitch the neighborhood back together in the face of fear. Watching her, I learned that strength is often quiet. It's not about the clash or the raised voice. It's about the choice to keep living with kindness afterward. So I'll end with what people in comments always want to know. What should you do if this happens to you? First, safety. Call the authorities if you feel threatened. Document everything. Talk to your neighbors. Find out if this is a pattern. And if you're able, don't let the fear of being judged stop you from speaking up. Silence is currency to people who traffic in intimidation. Second, know that legal systems can work, but they need witnesses and documentation to do so. Third, hold your community accountable. Start the conversation. It's awkward, sometimes, to say, "Hey, who are you with?" But it's worth it. If you've ever been intimidated by someone who used a uniform or a title to make you feel small, I want to hear your story. Tell me what happened, how you felt, what you did, and if you're comfortable, what you wish you'd done differently. If you live in a neighborhood with a shaky HOA or confusing enforcement rules, tell us how your community handles it. Let's talk about what's legal, what's ethical, and what we owe our neighbors. If nothing else, leave a comment about whether you think people should comply to avoid trouble or stand up and force the issue. To be honest, because I'd rather hear your messy, complex truth than a polite, safe take. Share this with someone who needs to know that they're not alone. Subscribe if you want more stories that dig into the messy, human stuff behind the drama, where justice isn't always swift and goodness looks more like neighborliness than bravado. Drop your questions below. Tell us what you do. I'll read them all.